Yeah, so yeah, this cost segregation is a big deal. I was looking at a report of on a $4 million purchase, which cost segregation was able to save over the first 6 years almost $1 million in taxes. That's some crazy depreciation right there, right?
Yeah.
That's
That's
game-changing
amazing.
money savings right there. Seriously.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
So typically, what percentage of the property is considered to be depreciable or depreciable?
Yeah. So like we mentioned, the first thing we do, right, is that the land does not depreciate. Okay, so you always have to allocate a certain amount to land value. And that's commonly found from your tax assessor or from an appraisal. And it's typically, depending on where you are located, what county, et cetera, it's typically between 10 and 20%. Okay, that's the norm, that's the average. There are cases like in California, in big cities in New York, where the land value is huge, just because the
Right.
value of that property is so much. It could be literally up to 40, 50, 60% land value. When that happens, the building and what remains, that's the only amount that can be depreciated. Okay, so that's the first thing we look at. But then what we do is we break down that depreciable basis, is what it's called,
Right.
that building, what's left over, into different categories.
Okay.
So the main structure, like I mentioned, the structural components, that's the main category. And then you'll have the cost segregation things like the 5-year property, personal, movable, tangible property, typically between 15 and 25% for multifamily properties, in that category. Then you'll have the land improvements, which depreciates on a 15-year schedule. That includes landscaping, pavement, a parking lot, sidewalks, anything like that, fencing, any type of signage, any type of anything outside of the building, essentially, that's not part of the building. It still actually has value because it's not land, it's land improvements.
Right.
So you can, pave a new parking lot. Guess what? You can now take that as a 15-year depreciation. That's typically on multifamily properties, anywhere, depending on where it's located, if it's a garden style versus if it's a city property. Obviously, the city property has very little land improvements. Okay, you got the building and then, 4 feet and the sidewalks, and then the street.
Yeah.
That's it. There's not much there. Garden style properties, usually typically between, 5 and 10%, is what's allocated to that. And other type of commercial properties may have larger percentages. So typically, we're talking about on a multifamily property, reallocation, this faster lives depreciation, 20 to 35%.
Oh man. So say there's an instance, okay, getting back to, I guess, my situation where, so say I started depreciation schedules for certain items.
Mm-hmm.
Would I be able to go back and do a proper engineered cost segregation analysis for 2020 that would then also provide me losses for the items that I didn't get in the first year of the 2019 or the first year of owning all my multifamily properties?
Yeah, there is a way to do that, to go back. It's called a look back study, which means you don't even have to amend your tax returns to do it. But what you do is there's a form, a 3115, a 3115 form that's filled out, and it's a change of depreciation, which means you may have taken certain depreciation beforehand, but going forward, we can now kind of recoup what the depreciation that was missed, that I could have taken in the previous year, and then go forward. However, there's one caveat. There's something called bonus depreciation, which we didn't touch on yet, but it was brought in the tax reform a few years ago, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which allows you to take all of that accelerated depreciation, that 5 and 15-year property. You can choose to take all of that in year number 1, which means that 20 to 35% on $1 million property, you're talking $200,000 in the first year as a tax write-off. If you already allocated certain things previously and you didn't elect the bonus depreciation, the one caveat is that going in the next year, you can no longer claim the bonus depreciation on that because you've already allocated it and done the cost segregation and done a certain amount of it at that point. So you kind of miss out, you lose out on that portion. But otherwise, yeah, you can actually go back. There is another approach that some people like to take. I have one big client who owns a number of hotels, dozens of hotels. And they were doing it, the cost segregation, kind of on their own, kind of winging it, like your CPA was saying. There's, the CPA, they had a controller in-house and he was familiar with it, but he wasn't following any of the approaches that the IRS requires, including a report, which has, a whole numbering system and a whole, nomenclature. And there's a whole report. You have to show your work. You have to show pictures. You have to show, it's a whole study. I mean, our reports are, typically 80, 90, 100 pages long, very detailed, breaking down all those assets, the calculations, etc. This guy, he was just breaking down an Excel sheet, this item is worth this, etc., and depreciating. But he was really worried that they were going to get audited and that would fail an audit, and this is a multi-million dollar company. Like I said, dozens of hotels. They're really worried. So what we ended up doing was kind of doing a cost segregation study as like an insurance policy, meaning the guy had already done all the depreciation and had already made all those allocations previously. We couldn't go out back to amend tax returns. We're not going to do that because that would just open up for an audit. But what we could do is say, here's this is what our findings were, and it's, pretty much in line with what your findings were, and therefore this is kind of the proof to back up what you'd already taken. So there is that approach as well that I've seen happen.